Hi, my name is Brandon, and I'm an alcoholic and addict in recovery. When I was in my addiction, I used to think that if I could just figure out a couple of different ways to control my drinking, then I could learn to moderate and I'd be okay. Because I knew that I was drinking too much and I knew that it was out of control. And there were plenty of times where I didn't really want to drink that I went ahead and had one or two or a dozen anyway. So in her book, This Naked Mind, author Annie Grace talks about this phenomenon and why the stress of decision making plays into our inability to control alcohol or drug intake, and why ultimately for a lot of us just learning to abstain from alcohol and drugs in general actually creates an environment where we can enjoy life in the ways that we were trying to during our addiction. So reading from her book, she says, when you use your brain's energy on tons of little decisions, like should I drink today, how many will I allow myself to have tonight, you deplete your decision-making abilities. Not to mention that the alcohol itself, once it enters your brain, negatively affects your ability to make sound decisions. Don't forget that over time, alcohol chemically damages your prefrontal cortex. This is the part of your brain that is vital to making sound long-term decisions. The prefrontal cortex balances out the pleasure-seeking animal regions of your brain, and when it is damaged by alcohol abuse, its effectiveness is decreased. You make worse decisions, and temptation is harder to resist because the animal regions of the brain, the parts that seek pleasure without considering consequences, become stronger than the more measured areas of the brain. So this is one of the things that happened to me a lot when I was in my addiction, was that I felt overwhelmed by all these decisions that I had to make throughout the day. And those decisions started first thing in the morning. Do I have a drink or not? And I faced that every single morning when I got up. It was, do I have a drink or not? Some mornings it was an easy decision. It was either easily, no, I'm not going to do that, I don't feel like that's appropriate, or it was easily, oh yeah, I'm having one or two or three. So starting the day with those decisions and then having to make decisions throughout the day related to that, decisions such as, do I go to work today? If I go to work, do I go for part of the day and then come home and try to pretend that I'm working from home and keep drinking? All these other decisions that I had to make through the day left me exhausted and with little power to actually make the right decisions once that I got to the point where they were offered to me. So being in a situation where you've got a lot of decisions that you have to make, where you have to question every single action that you take, that is an exhausting place to be. And when you're in a point like that, being able to control anything you do becomes stressful, difficult, and exhausting. And that's how I felt so much of my addiction. I was just exhausted and overwhelmed a lot of the times because of the decision points that I forced myself into. So she goes on to describe what she calls a cycle of insanity that resulted for her. She says, for me, it was a cycle of insanity. I would make myself promises about moderation, which I would keep at first. Success gave me a profound sense of satisfaction, of control. I felt proud, invincible. I could enjoy the nectar and then fly away. Then I would stumble upon more reasons, seemingly legitimate reasons, to drink more or to give in to temptation. Eventually, it became clear that moderation was not working, that I had crossed the line, but at that point, I could not stop. In the cycle of addiction, the funhouse, nothing is as it appears. I felt let down, ashamed of myself. I didn't understand why I continued to do what I had come to hate, and it terrified me. I felt alone and began to isolate myself from those close to me who I knew would be disappointed. I became a miserable shell of myself. Sometimes I was so deceived that I was not aware of how far I'd fallen. how dependent I had become. My tolerance would build, and within days, weeks, or months, I'd return to the chronic stage. This was so familiar when I read this. The cycle for me could be very short, so I could have a day where I came home and just had a few beers and didn't end up being too drunk at the end of the night. Woke up feeling good the next morning, and that gave me a sense of control. Or it could be like the period in my early 30s where I did stop drinking in the mornings and at lunch, and I started taking better care of myself and eating better. And I started exercising and getting in shape and actually got into the best shape of my life. And then all of a sudden before I knew it, and looking back, I can't even remember what happened. But before I knew it, I was back in that cycle of addiction. And that kind of thing, and it's not that I was ever out of it. So let me rephrase that. It's not that I was back in the cycle of addiction, but I was on that downward spiral again, where I was back to a point that I was drinking uncontrollably and felt like, as she said, a miserable shell of myself. Now, the good news is that in recovery, I have found even more pleasure out of life than I did when I was in my addiction. And, the whole reason that I drank, that I did drugs, was that I thought that would give me some sort of pleasure. And it turns out that it didn't. It caused more pain than it gave me pleasure. Now that I'm out of that, I actually enjoy things in life in a way that I never thought I could again. She talks about this in the last paragraph I'll read. She says, "Before addiction, I had a typical capacity for reward. When I was addicted, I no longer enjoyed normally rewarding experiences. In a situation like this, you start to fear you can only find joy with the assistance of the drug. This fear keeps you in the clutches of addiction. Experiences confirm that you only get pleasure from drinking. What you don't realize is that drinking pleasure is not true pleasure, and everyday pleasure will return as soon as you stop drinking and allow your brain and body to heal." And I love what she says here. In a situation like this, you start to fear that you can only find joy with the assistance of the drug. And this happened really fast with me. Like, I started drinking heavily when I was about 18 years old. And very quickly, I had in my head that no event was as pleasurable if I couldn't drink the way that I wanted to, or if I couldn't smoke pot the way if I wanted to, or even if I couldn't smoke cigarettes the way I wanted to. All these drugs that I got involved in my life, all of a sudden, anything I did, I felt that it wasn't going to be as pleasurable as it could be if the drugs were not involved the way I wanted them to be. And that's unfortunately what kept me in addiction for 20 years, was that I felt like life was not going to be worth living without these things. And what I found is that in truth, without alcohol and drugs, being out of the clutches of addiction and being at a point where I can actually enjoy life without constantly having to make decisions about my alcohol and drug use, I'm free to enjoy life in a way I never thought possible. Life to me is truly beautiful in a way that I have never experienced before. I caught glimpses of it in my addiction. I caught glimpses of it during times where I was a little bit less in the miserable stage. But I've never felt it as consistently and as powerfully as I have in my sobriety and recovery. So that's the good news, is that once you get past this point, once you get into recovery and are able to find things to fill your life, and if you are able to find a program of recovery that really works and speaks to you, life becomes way more beautiful than you could have ever imagined in your addiction. Doesn't mean there aren't tough times. There always will be. Doesn't mean there aren't going to be miserable times. There always will be in life. But the beautiful times and the ability to work through the hard times are so much more enhanced by not having all of the constant decision making that you have to deal with when drugs and alcohol are calling the shots. That's it for today. I'll be back tomorrow with more. Have a good one.